At 7:42 on May 27, 1940, Jack Churchill was crouched behind a crumbling stone wall near the French village of Lepinette, watching 5 German soldiers move through the morning mist toward his position. 33 years old. 14 years since Sandhurst. 0 confirmed kills in combat. The Wehrmacht had already crushed Poland in 36 days. Now their panzers were tearing through France at 40 miles per day, and the entire British Expeditionary Force was running for the sea. 11 men from Churchill's company had died in the past 72 hours. Officers were burning classified documents in roadside ditches. Sergeants were burying equipment they couldn't carry. Private soldiers were dropping their rifles just to run faster toward the coast. Jack Churchill was not running. He was holding a 6-foot English longbow, 70 pounds of draw weight, effective range of 200 yards in practiced hands. And Churchill's hands had represented Great Britain at the World Archery Championships in Oslo just 11 months earlier. 26th place out of 63 competitors from 14 nations. Not a champion, but a man who could drive an arrow through a playing card at 50 yards. A man who could kill silently before the target heard a single sound. The German patrol was at 30 yards now. Close enough. The sergeant leading them was good at his job. You could see it in the way he moved, checking hedges, scanning windows, looking for the threats he had been trained to recognize. Rifles, machine guns, grenades, the weapons of a modern war. He never thought to look for a medieval one. Churchill drew the string back to his ear. The yew wood flexed under the tension. His anchor point was perfect, the same position his muscles had memorized across 10,000 practice shots. He had made this exact draw countless times against targets. He had never made it with a human being at the other end. He released. The German sergeant dropped without a sound. The shaft was buried in his chest before his body had finished falling. It was the first confirmed longbow kill in a European war. Since the 1600s, it would also be the last confirmed longbow kill of the entire Second World War. And it happened because one British officer refused to accept that modern warfare had made ancient weapons obsolete. If you want to follow Jack Churchill through Norway, Sicily, Yugoslavia, and a Nazi concentration camp, hit subscribe. We rescue these stories from the archives, and this is one of the strangest and most extraordinary military careers in recorded history. Stay with us. The British Army in 1939 did not know what to do with Jack Churchill, and it never really figured it out. He had graduated from Sandhurst in 1926, served with the Manchester Regiment in Burma, learned to be a competent professional infantry officer. And then, in 1936, with no war in sight and peacetime garrison duty stretching out before him like an empty road, he quit. He went to Kenya and edited a newspaper. He appeared in films as an archer and a bagpipe player, including a minor role in The Thief of Baghdad. He rode motorcycles 1,500 miles across Burma and India, and once collided with a water buffalo in the dark on a rural road. He competed internationally in archery. He learned the Highland bagpipes by ear in a country far from any highlands. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939 and the world caught fire, Churchill walked back into his regiment as if he had merely stepped out for 3 years. He brought his longbow, the same one he had used in Oslo. He brought a Scottish broadsword, a basket-hilted claymore, the kind his ancestors had carried into clan battles centuries before. Gunpowder changed everything. And he brought the bagpipes. His brother officers were not sure whether to laugh or file a report. His commanding officers suspected he was a liability. The War Office had no regulation, no protocol, no precedent for an officer who wanted to carry medieval weaponry against panzer divisions armed with 88mm guns. Churchill had thought about this. He wasn't delusional. He knew a Mauser fired 15 rounds per minute and a longbow fired 10. He knew the rifle's effective range far exceeded the boughs at distance. He had read the manuals. He had studied the theory, but he had also studied something the War Office tacticians had forgotten: the psychology of close combat. In the chaos of an ambush, in the dark of a night raid, in the split-second moment when a man's brain is processing threat and deciding whether to fight or flee, a rifle pointed at you from cover was a known quantity. A soldier had trained against rifles. His nervous system knew what to do, but a screaming figure in a kilt, charging at full speed with a broadsword raised above his head, and music coming from somewhere, that scrambled the wiring. The mind froze. The body hesitated. And in combat, a moment of hesitation was often the last thing a man ever experienced. Churchill had understood something that couldn't be written into a field manual. Fear was a weapon. Used correctly, it was one of the most powerful weapons available. He was about to spend the next 5 years proving it. The 338,000 soldiers evacuated from Dunkirk between May 26th and June 4th. 1940 came home without most of their equipment, without most of their pride, and with the weight of defeat sitting on every face. They expected German invasion within weeks. The country expected it with them. Churchill came home with his bow, his sword, and his bagpipes. Within weeks, he had volunteered for something new. A secret unit the War Office was assembling in the Scottish Highlands, where no one could watch, and no one could ask too many questions about the methods being developed. They called themselves the Commandos. The training was designed to break men who could not be broken in ordinary ways. 30-mile marches in full kit through mountain terrain. Amphibious landings in water cold enough to stop the heart. Live ammunition fired over men's heads during exercises, not to simulate danger but to create it. Silent killing with knives and bare hands. Infiltration through defenses that had been built specifically to stop infiltration. Men who could not keep up went back to their original units. The walk home was the last thing any of them wanted. Churchill did not walk home. He was older than most of the volunteers, early 30s, in a unit full of young men pushing 20. He was also stronger, more relentless, and more creatively violent than any of them. He could put an arrow into a target at 200 yards. He could play the pipes while marching at speed. He could handle a broadsword with the muscle memory of a man who had been training with it for years. The other commandos didn't know what to make of him at first. Some thought he was performing. Some thought he was genuinely unwell. But as the weeks of training passed, the logic of him began to emerge. This wasn't eccentricity. This was a calculated approach to psychological warfare, executed with absolute conviction by a man who believed in it completely. By the autumn of 1941, Churchill was second in command of No. 3 Commando. The unit had run small operations along the Norwegian coast, gathering intelligence, testing their methods in the cold. Nothing decisive. Not yet. Then, in November of that year, the orders came down from Combined Operations Headquarters. No. 3. Commando would lead a major assault on the German garrison at Vaagso, a small island on the Norwegian coast, strategically critical, heavily defended, and deeply hostile to anyone trying to take it from the sea at dawn in December. Churchill requested permission to carry his sword and play his pipes during the assault. Permission was granted. Operation Archery, December 27, 1941. Vaagso controlled the fjord network, German ships, used to move Swedish iron ore, the raw material feeding the Reich's war machine. The island garrison held approximately 150 soldiers, 4 coastal artillery guns, an anti-aircraft battery, and fish oil factories the Germans had converted to produce glycerin for explosives. Taking it out would require overwhelming speed and violence before the defenders could organize a coherent response. Churchill studied the intelligence obsessively. he requested command of the first wave onto Moy Island, a fortified outcrop guarding the approach to the main town of South Vaagso. If the shore battery there wasn't destroyed in the first minutes of the assault, it would sink the landing craft, and the entire operation would collapse with them. The commandos boarded their transports on Christmas Day. They sailed north through Arctic darkness, past Scotland, into the Norwegian Sea. Ice formed on the deck rails. The temperature dropped through the floor. Men wrote letters home and tried not to think about what they were sailing toward. Churchill spent the crossing studying maps. He had 105 men under his direct command. They had 10 minutes to take the island after landing. Not 15, not 12, 10. At 08:45 on December the 27th, the landing craft were lowered into black water. Churchill took his position in the bow of the lead craft, bagpipes ready, sword on his belt. Around him, his men crouched behind the steel gunnels. Churchill stood fully exposed. 200 yards of Norwegian coastline stretched ahead through the smoke from RAF Hampton bombers. Behind it, HMS Kenya was firing 6-inch salvos at the shore battery. The whole coast lit up with each detonation like a slow-motion lightning storm. 150 yards, 100. The ramp dropped at 08:48. Churchill stepped into the surf and started playing The March of the Cameron Men. What followed was, by any technical military analysis, an act of complete psychological warfare. The Germans on the shore battery had been trained against everything except this. The sound of Scottish pipes cutting through artillery fire, through smoke, through the shock of dawn assault. Their training had no category for it. Their minds, for a critical few seconds, simply could not process what they were experiencing. Churchill finished the tune, set down the pipes, pulled a grenade from his belt, and hurled it at the nearest German position. Then he drew his sword and charged up the beach, screaming. The commandos surged after him. Moy Island fell in under 10 minutes. All 4 coastal artillery guns were destroyed. The German commander was taken prisoner, along with 15 of his men. Those who resisted died. Those who surrendered were bound and marched to the beach, when word came over the radio that the main assault on South Vaagso town was bogged down. More Germans than expected, street fighting, mounting casualties. Churchill commandeered a landing craft and crossed the strait with his men. The battle for the town lasted until mid-afternoon. Building by building, room by room, Churchill's commandos cleared it. They destroyed the factories. They captured documents, code books, prisoners. They killed Germans who refused to stop fighting. 17 British commandos died that day. 53 more were wounded. Churchill came through without a scratch. His sword had blood on it. His pipes were undamaged. The raid on Vaagso was the first major commando success of the war. One directive from Hitler, issued in direct response to it, diverted 30,000 additional German troops to Norwegian coastal garrison duty, troops that could have been killing people in Russia or North Africa. 300 commandos had tied down a division. Word moved through the British military the way good stories always do. The officer with the broadsword, the madman with the pipes. It stopped being a rumor and started being a reputation. By the summer of 1943, Churchill was commanding No. 2 Commando. The Allied invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, was the largest amphibious landing in history to that point. 160,000 troops, the eastern coast of the island. The opening of a second front against the Reich. Churchill came ashore at Catania with his complete inventory, sword at his hip, longbow and quiver across his back, bagpipes under his arm. His men had long since stopped questioning it. They had seen Vaagso. They trusted the system. Sicily fell. The Allies crossed to mainland Italy. The invasion at Salerno on September 9th, 1943, was supposed to catch the Germans off guard. The intelligence suggested light defenses. The intelligence was catastrophically wrong. Number 2, Commando landed straight into hell. Panzer divisions and artillery that weren't supposed to be there. A beachhead that almost collapsed in the first hours. Churchill's unit was assigned to hold a critical road and rail junction at Vietri-sul-Mare, overlooking the western bay of Salerno. If the Germans took Vietri, their artillery would pour fire directly onto the Allied beaches. The landing would be destroyed. For 5 consecutive days, Churchill held it. Infantry assaults, tank probes, counterattacks. His commandos fought from rubble and ditches and the ground floors of damaged buildings. They called in naval gunfire. They ran low on ammunition and kept fighting anyway. Then on the night of September 14th, new orders arrived. German forces had occupied the hills above the town of Molina. An observation post up there was directing artillery onto Allied positions with precision. It had to be destroyed. The problem was the approach, machine guns. Covering every obvious route, mortars already zeroed in on any large force trying to advance. Churchill looked at the terrain for a while. Then he picked one corporal, armed himself with his sword and his revolver, and walked into the dark. 2 men could move where 200 could not. 2 men had no visible tactical profile. 2 men could reach something that an assault company never would. They crawled through drainage ditches and along stone walls. They used darkness the way Churchill had used smoke at Vaagso, as cover, as concealment, as a weapon in itself. The Germans weren't expecting an attack from 2 men. They weren't looking for it. Churchill found the first position by the glow of cigarettes. A mortar crew, relaxed, unaware. He stepped out of the darkness with his sword in his hand. The Germans surrendered. He tied the first prisoner to his revolver lanyard like a leash and walked to the next position, and repeated it. By the time the sun came up, Churchill and his corporal had captured 42 German soldiers and an entire mortar squad. They marched them back to the British lines, the wounded ones placed on carts, pushed by their healthier comrades down a mountain path that Churchill later said looked like something from the Napoleonic Wars. The Distinguished Service Order citation that followed praised his courage, his initiative, his leadership. It did not mention the sword. Some things defied the available vocabulary of official military records. By spring 1944, the war in Italy had ground to a stalemate along the Gustav Line. The Allies needed new fronts, new pressure, new points of fracture. Churchill and No. 2 Commando received orders for Yugoslavia, supporting Tito's communist partisans against German occupation forces that had deployed over 500,000 men and were still losing ground in the mountains. The Germans in Yugoslavia had been hearing stories about Churchill for months. Intelligence reports circulating through Wehrmacht headquarters described an officer who carried a sword and played bagpipes in combat. Some officers dismissed it as British propaganda. Others read the reports more carefully. All of them underestimated what was coming. Churchill arrived on the Adriatic island of Vis in April 1944 and threw himself into the new theater with total commitment. He studied partisan tactics, planned raids against German supply lines, led attacks on outposts along the Dalmatian coast. The partisans were impressed. The Germans were confused. Then came the island of Brach. The objective was to capture a German-held island controlling key Dalmatian shipping lanes. Churchill assembled his force, commandos from numbers 40 and 43 and approximately 1,500 Yugoslav partisans. A mixed force, the British professional and precise, the partisans brave but loosely disciplined and poorly equipped. The landing on Brach was unopposed. The Germans had pulled back from the beaches to fortified positions in the hills, and then the partisans refused to advance. Their commanders looked at the German fortifications and decided to wait for morning. Churchill was furious. Every hour of delay was an hour for the enemy to reinforce, to prepare, to call for help, but he couldn't force them. He sat through the long night watching surprise dissolve into the darkness. The assault the next morning was brutal. Number 43, Commando went around the flank. Churchill led the direct assault with elements of Number 40. The partisans stayed at the landing area. The Germans were ready. Machine gun fire swept the open ground. Mortar rounds walked across the hillside, searching for the men advancing toward the ridgeline. Churchill pushed forward anyway. Pipes playing, sword at his side, dragging the attack up the slope by sheer force of presence. Then a German mortar team found his position. A salvo of rounds landed directly into the group of commandos clustered around Churchill. The explosions killed or wounded every man in the group. Every man except Churchill, who had been standing slightly apart from the others, playing his pipes to encourage the assault. He was alone on a hillside. His men were dead or dying. Germans were moving toward him. He had no ammunition left, no route of escape, no reinforcement coming. He sat down on a rock. He raised the pipes to his lips, and he played Will Ya No Come Back Again? A Scottish lament, a song of farewell, a melody that had been played over the graves of warriors for centuries. The Germans approached in a cautious semicircle. They stood there, watching a British officer surrounded by bodies, playing music at them. They didn't shoot. Accounts differ on whether it was confusion or something closer to respect for a man who chose that particular response to being surrounded and outgunned. A German grenade exploded near him. Churchill went down. When he woke up, he was a prisoner. The Germans were convinced that anyone named Churchill had to be related to the Prime Minister. They flew him to Berlin under guard, hoping for intelligence. They found a man who had no connection to Winston Churchill whatsoever, no access to strategic secrets, and no intention of providing anything useful to his interrogators. They sent him to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, north of Berlin, a special compound for prominent prisoners, politicians, resistance leaders, men who had plotted against Hitler and survived long enough to be held as potential bargaining chips. Churchill began planning his escape within weeks of arriving. He studied the camp layout, the guard rotations, the fence lines, the watchtower sight lines. He recruited allies. He identified a drainage ditch in the garden area accessible to his compound and started digging. They worked at night with spoons, scraps of metal, and their bare hands. The excavated dirt disappeared into compost piles. The tunnel extended 110 meters, passed under the perimeter fence, and emerged in a wooded area beyond the wire. On September 23, 1944, Churchill and 4 other British officers went through it. He paired with squadron leader Bertram James, one of the few survivors of the Great Escape from Stalag Luft. 3. A man whose 50 comrades had been executed by the Gestapo after their own tunnel escape just months earlier. Their plan: walk 200 kilometers north to the Baltic coast, find a boat, reach neutral Sweden. For 2 weeks, they moved through Nazi Germany on foot. Night travel, day concealment, vegetables stolen from fields, water from streams, no maps, no compass, no documents, just 2 men in ragged clothes moving north through an enemy country whose language neither of them spoke. They made it to within a few kilometers of the Baltic coast before a patrol stopped them outside Rostock and demanded identification papers. They were arrested, identified, and returned to captivity. This time transferred to a camp in the Austrian Alps, far from Allied lines, deep in the mountains, with winter closing in. Churchill spent the winter of 1944 to 45 watching Germany collapse from inside it. Allied bombers flew overhead daily. News filtered in. The Soviet advance from the east. The Allied push through France. Hitler's increasingly frantic orders to men who could barely fight anymore. In late April 1945, the SS moved Churchill and approximately 100 40 other prominent prisoners from Austria toward the Tyrol. They were hostages now, potential leverage in whatever negotiation might preserve the lives of the men who had run the camps. The prisoners were marched through mountain passes, not knowing if they would be released or shot in a forest somewhere, and left for the spring thaw to find. The end came through an unlikely intervention. Prisoners approached Wehrmacht officers and told them plainly that they feared execution at SS hands. The officers listened. A German army unit under Captain Wischard von Alvensleben moved in. Wehrmacht soldiers outnumbering SS guards, a tense standoff in a mountain pass, and then the SS withdrew. The prisoners were left in a small Italian village with no guards, no instructions, and no particular plan. Most of them stayed and waited for Allied forces to arrive. Jack Churchill started walking south. He had been a prisoner for nearly a year. He had escaped once and been dragged back. He was not going to sit in a village while there was still any possibility that somewhere, someone was still fighting and might need him. He crossed the Italian Alps on foot, 150 kilometers, a bad ankle, no food, no weapons, no identification. 8 days of mountain terrain in the fading weeks of the European War. He walked into Verona and found an American armored reconnaissance unit. The Americans did not know what to make of the ragged British officer who materialized from the mountains, claiming to be a commando lieutenant colonel with no documents and an extraordinary story. Churchill had no way to prove who he was, except by the force of his own conviction, by the authority in his voice, by the increasingly impossible sequence of events he described in precise, matter-of-fact detail. They sent him home. Churchill arrived in Britain in May 1945, just as the war in Europe was ending. Germany had surrendered. The camps were being opened, but Japan was still fighting, and for Churchill, that meant the war was still fighting. He requested immediate transfer to the Far East. He had studied Japanese tactics, Japanese fortifications, Japanese defensive doctrine. He planned to lead commandos onto Japanese beaches with his sword and his pipes, exactly as he had done in Norway and Sicily and the mountains of Italy. He was on a ship heading east when the Enola Gay dropped its payload over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. 3 days later, Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan announced its surrender. Churchill received the news with an emotion that those who served with him described as something close to grief. He had waited years for this final chapter and found the book already closed. His reported comment that without the American atomic bombs the war might have gone on another 10 years was a dark joke, but it pointed at something real about who he was. He was a man who had found his fullest self in the extremity of combat. Peace was not a state that came naturally to him. The British military career that followed was, inevitably, a series of diminishing returns. His service record was remarkable by any objective measure. Distinguished Service Order with Bar, Military Cross with Bar, mentioned in dispatches repeatedly across multiple theaters. He had fought in France, Norway, Sicily, Italy, Yugoslavia. He had been captured, had escaped, had been recaptured, had walked out of the mountains anyway. He had captured 42 prisoners with a sword. The army offered him training assignments and administrative positions. He took them without enthusiasm. He qualified as a parachutist in his 40s, not because he needed the qualification, but because jumping from aircraft was one of the few available activities that still produced the particular quality of feeling that he was chasing. He transferred to Palestine in 1947, where he commanded a battalion trying to hold the territory together as Britain prepared to withdraw and leave Jewish and Arab populations to fight out the consequences. On April 13, 1948, a convoy of Jewish medical personnel was ambushed on the road to Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus. 77 people died in what became the Hadassah Convoy Massacre. Churchill organized the evacuation of 700 Jewish doctors, students, and patients trapped on Mount Scopus afterward. Moving through contested areas with the same composed, unhurried authority he had used on every battlefield in Europe. When asked later how he navigated the negotiations with hostile parties on multiple sides, he offered the simplest possible analysis. People were less likely to shoot at someone who was smiling at them. He retired from the British Army in 1959, aged 52. His retirement was, characteristically, its own kind of campaign. He developed a passion for radio-controlled model warships. He refurbished old steamboats and piloted them along the Thames between Richmond and Oxford. He played the pipes at memorial ceremonies and regimental gatherings, a living fossil of the commando traditions he had helped build from scratch. He threw his briefcase from the train window each evening on the way home from London, having calculated the precise point where the railway ran alongside his garden, landing it in his own backyard every time, sparing himself the walk from the station. On July 21, 1955, a 48-year-old former soldier stood on the banks of the River Severn in Gloucestershire, holding a homemade surfboard. He had read about the tidal bore, a wave that traveled up the river from the Bristol Channel twice daily, and decided to ride it. Local fishermen had watched that wave pass for generations. Nobody had ever tried to stand on it. Churchill paddled out, caught the bore, and surfed it for more than a mile upstream. Of course he did. Jack Churchill died on March 8, 1996, aged 89. He had outlived most of his commandos, most of his fellow prisoners at Sachsenhausen, most of the men who had followed him up Norwegian beaches and Italian hillsides. He died quietly in Surrey, surrounded by family, decades removed from the freezing water of Norwegian fjords and the burning hills above Salerno. The obituaries struggled with him. One British newspaper wrote that if Churchill had not existed, it would have been impossible to invent him. That any work of fiction featuring a man with his precise biography would fail on the grounds of implausibility. A soldier who killed enemies with a longbow in the era of tanks, who captured prisoners with a broadsword in the era of machine guns, who played music while Germans pointed rifles at him, who escaped from a concentration camp on foot, was recaptured, survived the winter, and then walked 150 kilometers through the Alps to find a war to return to. He was not the most decorated soldier of the Second World War. He was not the most brilliant tactician. He did not turn the tide of any campaign or change history through strategic vision. What he did was stranger and, in its way, more durable. He proved that individual character could matter in a war of millions. That unconventional thinking, applied with absolute commitment, could accomplish what firepower alone could not. That fear was as real a weapon as steel or explosive, and that a man who understood it could wield it without a single bullet. His legacy lives in the special operations, forces that trace their lineage to those Scottish training grounds, in every soldier who has been told something is impossible and decided to test the claim personally, in the very concept that small groups of men, highly trained and psychologically distinct from the mass, could strike deep and vanish before the machine had time to respond. Mad Jack Churchill, the last knight, the first commando, the man who surfed river bores and threw his briefcase from moving trains, and once sat down on a hillside surrounded by enemies and chose, as his final act of defiance, to play a lament. The war ended. He was disappointed.